Good evening. My name is Stephen Woolfolk. I'm the Director of Programming and Marketing at the Kansas City Public Library. It's a pleasure to be here tonight as we continue our online series of signature events. Tonight's program is co-presented by Rainy Day Books. I hope that you always support local business, but I also hope that you understand that now more than ever how important that is. So please, if you're interested in the book tonight or any other book, you visit them at rainydayBooks.com, stop by the store in Fairway, or give them a call at 913-384-3126. We always appreciate our friends at Rainy Day Books and the great authors that they bring us, and it's a pleasure to work with them. Also, if at any point tonight you have questions, you can leave those in the comments or in the chat on the YouTube page, and we'll get to as many of those as we can after the presentation. So with that, our guest tonight is Tom Clavin. Tom has worked as a newspaper and website editor, magazine writer, and a TV and radio commentator. He's received awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation, and the National Newspaper Association. He's the author of 19 books, 4 of which have appeared on the New York Times bestseller list, and he's presented twice previously at the Kansas City Public Library. He first visited in 2009 at our Central Library for a discussion of The Last Stand of Fox Company, a true story of U.S. Marines in combat. He returned in 2017 at our Plaza branch for a discussion of Dodge City, Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and the wickedest town in the American West. Tonight, he joins us online for a discussion of his latest book, Tombstone, the Earp brothers, Doc Holliday, and the Vendetta Ride from Hell. Tom spent countless hours examining the legends surrounding Tombstone and has pieced together what he believes to be the most likely answer as to what really happened. Tom, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to be in Kansas City before. As you mentioned, I've been involved in events sponsored by Rainy Day Books, appeared at the library. I've also had the pleasure, I think twice in the last 3 years, to be a participant in the Kansas Book Festival. I have some really fond memories of talking about books and talking to people who love books in and around the Kansas City area. I know the book festival's in Topeka, but that's pretty close. And I'm especially glad to have this opportunity to talk about Tombstone because of the circumstances, and not just me, of course, but many other authors who had books come out anytime in the last 4 to 5 months. You know, really anything's March 1 on, and Tombstone was published on April 21, I believe, or close to it around then. You know, for authors who don't particularly care about going out and giving talks and meeting readers and going to bookstores and book conventions and libraries, then it was probably didn't matter that much that all of that was denied to us. But for somebody like me, I really enjoy talking about books. And in my case, and anybody who's had seen me perhaps before, when they say author reading, I don't take that literally. I don't stand there and read from a book. I just discuss it or tell stories from it, or, you know, I don't wing it. I prepare for these things, but I like it to be sort of like a conversation between the author and the audience. So unfortunately, I can't do that face to face. I'm really, really hoping that circumstances allow that to happen soon, sometime before the end of the year, certainly next year, next spring. So for now, we do the best we can with this. And I'm getting used to Zoom. I don't know if I'll be completely used to it. I'm a bit of a Luddite when it comes to computer technology, but I'm getting the hang of it. And I've done a couple of these things. And I thought for this talk, I'm going to start really toward the end. I don't mean I'm going to tell the story of Tombstone backwards. What I mean is when I usually say any questions, what an immediate question that gets asked is, and sort of like where I'd like to start this talk, is why do a book on Tombstone? People point out that there have been books involving Wyatt Earp, for example, before. The Gunfight, the OK Corral. Some people may specifically point to Jeff Gwynn's very, very good book, The Last Gunfight, which came out in 2012. And then they often bring up movies. Some people can rattle off, there was the movie called Gunfight, the OK Corral with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas. There was My Darling Clementine, considered one of John Ford's greatest Westerns. with Henry Fonda and Victor Mature and Walter Brennan, you have a film called Tombstone, which came out, I think, in '93 with Kurt Russell and Sam Elliott and Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday. And so I've actually had a chance, because of that question, to give it as much thought, if not more thought, than when I began working on the book. So there were a whole number of reasons. I'm not going to list them all, but there are a few I want to talk about. One is that it's for a very practical reason. When I was finished with the book Dodge City, I turned it in. You go through the production process behind the scenes to get it ready for when it's going to come out. And that came out in 2017. And actually, by the time it came out, I was under contract with my same publisher, St. Martin's Press, to do a very different kind of nonfiction book, and had spent a few months working on that. That had to be put aside because I went on the tour for Dodge City, which included being in Kansas City. And as I was on this tour, the book had come out, and its very first week out, it was on all the bestseller lists, New York Times bestseller lists, and others, Publishers Weekly, and so I'd stayed there for a while. And so when I got back and was having lunch with my editor, he said, "Listen, would you put that book that you're working on now aside, because we're getting a lot of people asking us from booksellers around the country, can Clavin do a book that has a similar setting, let's put it that way, or another iconic character of the American West?" And immediately Wild Bill Hickok popped into my mind, because I had always been very interested in that character, but I had to find out what's been done. Certainly things had been done on Wild Bill, but I discovered that except for him being mentioned in other people's books, there had not been really a biography, a full treatment of Wild Bill Hickok since 1964, when Joseph Rosa did one, which is very good. And there's been information since then. So that's what we decided upon. I got to work on that. And in 2019, early 2019, Wild Bill came out. It was a similar scenario. It appeared on bestseller lists, it was very well reviewed, people were buying it. And again, my editor's saying, you know what, we have here basically a arc that begins with Wild Bill chronologically as really the prototype of the post-Civil War lawman who would tame a town with his guns. So then you move from like the late 1860s, early 70s to the mid 1870s and late 1870s, which is when the Dodge City book takes place, with very young Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson teaming together to put the peace into peace officer. There's that transition going on in the frontier, that the idea was, you're not going to make a town peaceful and civilized and a place where people can raise their families by killing the bad guys faster than they kill the good guys. So they were trying to do things like put people under arrest, put them on trial, let the justice system get traction and work in the American frontier. And so we said, we have to complete what appears to be a trilogy, and that is that arc to its completion, where you have Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and Wyatt's brothers in the early 1880s in Tombstone, and where there seems to be a completion or close to it of the evolution of the frontier lawmen. So I wrote Tombstone. One reason why is because it completes that trilogy, that frontier lawman trilogy. I certainly hope, we don't have any control over these things, but Tombstone came out this past April, as I mentioned. It's in hardcover. Wild Bill and Dodge City are already in paperback. And when Tombstone comes out in paperback next spring, late next winter, next spring, I'm certainly hoping that I could be on the road, go on tour, and discuss all three books as they're in paperback and available in paperback as the Frontier Lawman trilogy. So if that happens, I'm very much looking forward to it. Another reason why I wanted to do Tombstone is because of the reason why it's named Tombstone. As I was doing more research and getting more into the story, it really struck me that Tombstone was the last frontier Wild West town. It was the it was only, I think, about 7 or 8 years after the Earp Vendetta ride ended in 1882 that the federal government itself said the American frontier is closed. I mean, we're not including Alaska; it wasn't part of the country by that at that point. But as far as the lower 48 was concerned, there was really no more front. There was always, ever since Daniel Boone crossed the Cumberland Gap, across the Appalachians, and entered Kentucky and explored the Ohio Valley, the impetus of migration by people of European descent, anyway, was always west. You know, get to the Mississippi, go west of the Mississippi. Get to the Missouri, go west of the Missouri. Keep going west. Go across Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, Colorado, the Dakotas. Keep moving west. Well, Tombstone was a boom town in the early 1880s, and you couldn't go any further west from Arizona. You go to California. California was already settled. California was not the frontier in the 1880s. So I wanted to tell a story about what Tombstone represented as far as our so-called manifest destiny, as far as our always having a next frontier to explore. Tombstone was kind of it, and it was, which sort of leads into a related reason. It was where the Old West and the New West clashed. To me, the gunfight at the OK Corral was very, very symbolic of the last remnants of the Wild West trying to hold on, clinging to the more lawless aspect of the West and the New West. You know, that Tombstone was trying to become it called itself the San Francisco of the Southwest. It was trying to be a sophisticated city, a progressive city, a place that was peaceful, that people could raise their families and build schools and churches and things like that. And start to embrace the possibility of being, you know, one of the early 20th century Western towns. And so Tombstone was a flashpoint for that. It was where the Old West and the New West confronted each other. And, you know, what was going to win? That's a big part of what I think the OK Corral, so-called OK Corral gunfight was all about. Another reason is the gunfight. It is obviously one of the most famous violent confrontations in American history. I'm not including mass confrontations like Antietam or places like that. It's been inaccurately portrayed in our popular culture in a couple of ways. One, opinions have shifted over the decades. The Earps were the good guys. The Earps were the bad guys. The McLaurys and the Clantons were the bad guys. McLaurys and the Clantons were innocent victims of the bad guy Earps. So what was really the truth to that, as far as we could tell by what we know now and what we can dig up from the past? So another reason why it's been misrepresented, for obvious reasons, by Hollywood, because he wanted to make it more dramatic. You know, in the, you know, and so if facts had to be cast aside, that's okay, as far as Hollywood is concerned, because maybe they were making the story better. I don't know if that's always been true. I mean, My Darling Clementine by John Ford, again, it's been considered one of his greatest Westerns. They usually say it in the same breath as Stagecoach and The Searchers, for example, and Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. But and it is a very good picture, as long as you don't care about the truth. In that movie with Wyatt Earp, played by Henry Fonda, Virgil Earp dies before the gunfight at the OK Corral takes place. Doc Holliday dies during the gunfight at the OK Corral, neither of which was true. In the movie named The Gunfight at the OK Corral, the gunfight is like this long, drawn-out, 15-minute shoot 'em up with people, you know, running after each other and hiding behind horses and water barrels and buildings and stuff. That's very far from the truth. So another reason for writing the book is to portray the gunfight accurately. I think there were fascinating characters that I wanted to portray accurately, which, again, popular culture is often not done. Or you have the ebb and flow of, was Wyatt Earp a good guy or a bad guy? That's again, over the decades, that's the opinion shifting depending on what side is telling the story and what their agenda is. But in the movies especially, we've seen not quite accurate portrayals. I mean, in My Darling Clementine, Doc Holliday, for example, is played by Victor Mature. Victor Mature was a big, strong, strapping actor, not the consumptive, close to death that Doc Holliday was. I think even though he does a good job, I think the funniest one, and I don't mean that in a mean-spirited way, in the gunfight at the OK Corral, you have Doc Holliday portrayed by Kirk Douglas. Okay, so how accurate is that? You have the sickly Doc Holliday portrayed by Spartacus. So that doesn't quite work. Some people might point to the film Tombstone with Kurt Russell as Wyatt Earp and Sam Elliott as Virgil Earp, and you have Val Kilmer. And with the possible exception, some people may say, "Oh, his most famous role was in Top Gun," but really, I think his most indelible performance was as Doc Holliday in Tombstone, and they got us sort of closer to being right. And I'm not dismissing Dennis Quaid's portrayal in the film named Wyatt Earp, which is very good too. But for the most part, we haven't gotten accurate portrayals of the main characters. I think that another reason is that when I was researching the book, I saw that there were a lot of, to me, very intriguing characters in the story beyond the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday. But before I go any further with that, I do want to mention another reason for doing the book is I did want to show the closeness and bond and clannishness of the Earp brothers. There were actually 5 of them in Tombstone at the same time. This was going to be an Earp brothers reunion and a place of great promise for them and a golden opportunity, not to be lawmen, but to be businessmen, successful people. So you had Wyatt and Virgil and Morgan and James and Warren Earp. So I really wanted to have them come through as characters and to show how much of a dream Tombstone was for them to be fulfilled, and how poignant it is that it didn't happen nearly the way they planned it to be. But there are a lot of other characters who inhabit the Tombstone world. I mean, a couple of obvious ones are on the cowboy side of things, where you have Curly Bill Brocius and Johnny Ringo, who are both, probably would have been diagnosed as being sociopaths, but they were interesting and charming sociopaths. And you have the McLaury brothers. You have the corrupt ranchers. I shouldn't say corrupt ranchers. They were ranchers who, they had it hard. They were trying to put down roots in the Tombstone area, but it was hard living. And sometimes they had to cut corners. And cutting corners could even include, which they did fairly often, the sneaking across the Mexico border during the night and stealing cattle from Mexican herds, sneaking them back across the border, rebranding them, and then selling them to the U.S. Army and to Tombstone and Bisbee and even as far as Tucson, because the demand was so high for beef, and they couldn't supply that. They couldn't keep up with that demand. So you have the McLaurys, you have the Clantons, who were ranchers also. You had some of the townspeople. You had characters who were, Clara Browne is one of my favorite characters, because nobody knows who Clara Browne is, but she plays an important role in the Tombstone story. She became a well-known, pioneering female American journalist. Her start was in Tombstone. She had just followed her husband. They got married, I think, in San Diego. Her husband went out to Tombstone when it was being advertised as a boom town. There's work for everybody. Everybody's going to get rich. So he went out there, got a job, sent for her eventually. She showed up. And the only reason why she was there was that she was going to keep her husband company. But she loved to write, and she was fascinated by what she saw going on around her. The environment of Tombstone, the surroundings, the people, the heat, the monsoon rains. There was everything about Tombstone intrigued her. So she started writing these long accounts of what she observed and witnessed and experienced back to friends in San Diego, and they were published in the San Diego paper. I think it was the Tribune of the Union, and became very popular. So for the years that she was in Tombstone, she would be, as these events were happening, that's portrayed in the book, she'd be writing about them and sending them back and they were published in San Diego. So she was a very interesting character. Another one is George Parsons, who was a real young go-getter. You know, he was ambitious to be a respectable, hopefully comfortably wealthy businessman, and who was a friend of the Earps and supported the Earps. And he was thankfully, a very disciplined and prolific diary writer or journal writer. And so it's been a great advantage to be able to take advantage of George Parsons' eyewitness accounts of things that are going on, shootings in the street, stagecoach robberies, everyday things. When Tombstone nearly burnt down in June 1881, George Parsons was right in the thick of things. In fact, he was trying to save a building, was pouring water on an adjacent building when it collapsed and took him, threw him off the scaffolding or whatever he was on, and he almost died. But he was heroic. He was going to save as much of Tombstone as he could. And he wrote about his own adventures and his own recovery, and wanted to go back and making money and being a young ambitious businessman. So we have the newspaper editors. We have Johnny Behan, who was first the assistant sheriff of Pima County and then became the sheriff of Cochise County. You have his relationship with Wyatt Earp, because you had Wyatt fell in love with his fiancee, Josephine Marcus. So there was that dynamic to the story too, that Johnny Behan was not only I guess you could say an adversary of the Earp brothers, because he was a sheriff that's sort of siding with the cowboys, or at least would not do anything to stop their transgressions. But he also had Wyatt Earp stealing his girl, who would eventually become Mrs. Earp number 4. And mentioning that, you had the relationship between Wyatt Earp and Josephine Marcus, which began in Tombstone, and even when Wyatt Earp was there living in Tombstone with wife number 3. And you had Allie Earp, Virgil's wife. You had Louisa Earp, Morgan's wife. There was that dynamic of the Earps always being together, supporting each other, having each other's back, which became even more intense as they became targets. And another reason, very important to me, about doing this book is that most people, my experience has been from talking to people and when I was doing the research, and of course watching the movies. I mean, I've just mentioned a few, there are others. The end of the story is usually the climactic gunfight. And in most cases, that gunfight has been misrepresented, to say the least. Again, the gunfight that ends the gunfight at the OK Corral goes on for like 10 or 12 or 15 minutes. And you have Burt Lancaster as Wyatt Earp, who's, chasing Billy Clanton, played by Dennis Hopper, and, down the street into a saloon where they have another. None of that is true. So really 2 things. One, I wanted to portray the gunfight accurately, which was not this long, drawn-out affair where people were chasing each other around Tombstone and hiding behind water barrels and buildings. There were 30 shots fired in 30 seconds, not even in the OK Corral, but in an alleyway or a vacant lot that I think was only about 15 feet wide. That's a very intense firefight. That's not what gets portrayed. And the other thing is, it's not the end of the story. I wanted to tell the end of the story, go beyond the gunfight. The gunfight is enormously important. There's no doubt about it. I mean, few people, certainly of a certain age, would not know what the gunfight at the OK Corral was. You've heard it in one way or another throughout popular culture, maybe in school, TV shows, biographies of Western figures, things like that. But at the conclusion of the gunfight, or soon after the conclusion of the gunfight, in which 3 men died and 3 were wounded out of the 8 men who began the gunfight in that vacant lot together. Wyatt and his 2 brothers and Doc Holliday were arrested and charged with murder. And Virgil and Morgan were too injured by their wounds to actually go to the courthouse and stand trial. But Wyatt and Doc did stand trial. And that trial went on for the entire month of November of 1881. That was not just quick affair, a quick inquest, ask a few questions. Okay, what's your decision? Do we go to a full trial or not? This was a very, very important legal proceeding in which the judge, Wells Spicer, could have at the conclusion said, we're going to send you to Tucson because we think there's enough here that you really should be getting a full official trial for murder. And it's quite possible that if Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp had been convicted, they would have spent the rest of their lives in prison, at least spent a great deal of time in prison, possibly even been hung. That's the end of the story of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. Then after the trial, there's months more of conflict between the Earp family and the Cowboys. And you have Virgil being ambushed and shot, and then you have Morgan being ambushed and shot and killed on a Saturday night, the night before Wyatt Earp's 34th birthday, when Wyatt was with his brother, who got shot in the back and killed. And that was the catalyst for what's called the Vendetta ride. When Wyatt, his brother Warren, and Doc, and I think about 3 or 4 allies of theirs, saddled up, and they took off. They were going to track down the men who shot the Earp brothers. And that's a very exciting part of the story that I thought, give it its proper emphasis. So to me, it was important that the Tombstone story be given as full a treatment as possible. I treated myself to a cherry cola. And I did have some trepidation when I started working on the book, because I got worried. I said, okay, if I'm devoting myself to doing the research and telling what the true story is and portraying the characters accurately and the events and the historical period at the time, might the story just not be as interesting? Maybe Hollywood was right to change things, to change characters and who dies when and what happens where, because the true story just wouldn't work. But I was, very, very pleased that the true story does work. It's got all kinds of action. It's got the gunfight, of course, but it's got stagecoach robberies. It's got romance. You have Wyatt and Josephine Marcus, as their relationship is growing, which is causing even more conflict between Wyatt and the sheriff. You have other characters, Big Nose Kate Elder, who's Doc's girlfriend, on and off again girlfriend. When they would have all these fights, and she would leave, he would leave, and they'd get back together. So there's plenty of action to it. There's romance. There's suspense. I mean, is Wyatt and Doc going to be, are the judge going to convict them or say they are guilty of murder at the end of this trial? And it's not like you could tell. People would say, well, obviously they were not found guilty because we know that Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday are Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday, famous characters. Well, yeah, but they could have spent time in jail. A lot of people don't know how much hung in the balance with that trial. Even their defense attorney was a man who was known as a great orator. So he's using his oratorical skills to plead on behalf, basically, the lives of Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp. And so, to me, I wanted to tell the many facets of the Tombstone story. And again, the city of Tombstone itself. I mean, a fellow named Ed Schieffelin discovered silver in 1877, and his he had been a part-time Army scout, and the cavalrymen used to joke when he was going out prospecting on his own often. And they say the only thing you're going to find out there is your tombstone. Well, lo and behold, he finds this major silver strike, and he names his claim Tombstone. And eventually, the town that goes up around it is called Tombstone. And it went up very fast. I mean, that's one of the interesting things to me about the city. Is in 1877 it was nothing. I mean, it wasn't even a watering hole in the desert. And by 1881, only 4 years later, when the gunfight took place, it was calling itself the San Francisco of the Southwest. There were hotels, there were saloons, there were theaters, French restaurants, Italian restaurants, Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, troops of Gilbert and Sullivan operettas were coming to Tombstone to perform. The governor was coming to visit. There was even talk about would it be in the county seat, could it be possibly at some point be the state capital. So that really fascinated me, that Tombstone was that kind of boomtown, and excuse me, and really the last one on the American frontier. Again, excuse me. There was gun violence after Tombstone. There were still stage robberies. There were still bank robberies. I mean, that especially bank robberies went into the 20th century. But as far as a confrontation where two groups of men went into a space where they were facing each other in a short distance, and looked at each other and pulled guns and got into this gunfight, that was not really something that happened again in the American West. And as it turned out, sorry, as it turned out, the both McLaury brothers and Billy Clanton were killed. So in a sense, you could say the Old West, the Wild West, lost that gunfight, with the Earps representing the New West. So there's that symbolic aspect to it. It really was a representative confrontation, a showdown. So I wanted to, sorry, I just found there were a lot of facets to the story. I thought that given that there had not been a full-fledged book about Tombstone, the gunfight, since Jeff Gwynn's book 8 years earlier, and also I was looking at some different angles than he did. Again, I recommend his book highly. But there were some things about his book that I thought I wanted to elaborate more on. And really, it's one of our mythical tales. You know, in my author's note, I refer to it as like, it's almost like Dodge City and Tombstone or Iliad and the Odyssey of our mythical American West. And you could tell that story again and again, each time maybe with a different either perspective or angle or flavor to it or shade to it. You know, it's almost like how many Lincoln biographies have there been published? Thousands. Why would anybody at this point want to write another book about Abraham Lincoln? First of all, you might because he had such a remarkable life and is obviously one of the top 5 pivotal figures in American history. Some would say he's number 1. And so for that reason, you want to tell that story again of one of the most, if not the most remarkable American in our history. But you can find different aspects to his story. There's still things you can find by going through his letters, what people wrote to him, friendships that he had. And I found that to be true of Tombstone. And then circling back to where I began the talk, that arc comes to a completion. Tombstone is the final book in the 3-book trilogy. The arc of the frontier lawmen, which began basically after the Civil War in 1865 with Wild Bill, then in the 1870s with Dodge City and Wyatt and Bat Masterson, and then into the 1880s with Wyatt, his brothers, and Doc Holliday. it comes to sort of like a natural conclusion to that arc. And there it is. The trilogy is complete. I do like to think I wanted to be very careful that I think if you don't have to feel like, oh my God, I can't read Tombstone. I guess I got to go back and read the first two books. No, you don't. I really do think Tombstone stands on its own. I think Wild Bill stands on its own. I think Dodge City stands on its own, especially in the case of Dodge City, because there's no intention to go farther than that. But I think that now you could read each book on its own. Just read one, pick one that you might think is more interesting, or that you can get a paperback, which would be Wild Bill and Dodge City. Read a couple of them, or some people have a little more time than they thought they would have at this point in their lives in 2020, and read all the way through. See that arc, see the characters and how many of them cross trails over the course of those 3 books. It's really remarkable. So I think I've adequately explained. I hope I have. I mean, I'll be ready to entertain questions, but I wanted to basically make that the focus of my talk. Why do this book, and what about it do I think separates it from previous book portrayals? Let's put it that way, whether it's a book or on screen, previous portrayals of Tombstone, of the Earps, of Doc Holliday, and of that period on the frontier in American history. So thank you. If you've listened this far, we'd love to entertain questions.
Thanks, Tom. That was great. We do have some audience questions here.
Great.
I'm going to start with an audience question or an audience comment paired with a question of my own. So the audience member comments, 30 shots fired at that close distance and only 2 were killed. They must have been lousy shots.
Yeah.
My question was, you go to great lengths in the book to kind of separate the myth from the facts. And one myth is that Doc Holliday was kind of one of the great shots of the Wild West. What was that true? And what are some other myths that you think you can dispel that might be widely believed?
Well, it's funny because your question, maybe by design, but it ties to the observation that the viewer made. Doc, there were the outcome of the gunfight at the OK Corral was that 3 men were killed and 3 were wounded. So, and the men who were killed were hit by more than 1 shot. So of those 30 shots, maybe 10 or 11 found their mark. But yes, you're kind of surprised. How did any of them survive? How did Wyatt Earp, excuse me, how did Wyatt Earp be completely unscathed in that short space and of those gunshots fired and none touched him? But there's actually kind of an amusing part when, as a prelude to the gunfight at the OK Corral, Doc Holliday was not a good shot. Not saying he didn't kill people with his gun, but it took some work because Doc couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, and the Earps knew it. So, in anticipation of confronting the McLaurys and the Clantons, Virgil had deputized Wyatt and Morgan, because Wyatt and Morgan were not lawmen. Virgil was the lawman. He was the marshal of Tombstone. He deputizes Wyatt and Morgan, and Doc shows up, and he's hurt. He considered himself, Wyatt's best friend. Wyatt was Doc's only friend, but Doc says to Wyatt, "How can you go into battle, so to speak, without me? I'm your side man. I'm your wingman." So Virgil kind of holds his nose and deputizes Doc Holliday, because in any other circumstance, the last guy you want wearing a badge is Doc Holliday. And then he gives Doc a shotgun, because they know that if they go into a confrontation with Doc Holliday having only a pistol, first of all, he's probably not going to hit anybody. Second of all, he might be just as likely to hit one of the Earps as hit the opponent. And third of all, it's kind of hard not to hit somebody with a shotgun. So that was one of the myths. Doc Holliday was known as a gunman and a gunfighter, but he was really a rather poor shot. So that was a fun myth to kind of dispel. sort of related is where there's things that you never know about this. One example is that Bat Masterson was in Tombstone in 1881. If one particular thing had not happened, today when we're talking about the gunfight at the OK Corral, one of the participants would have been Bat Masterson. It would have been Bat and the Earp brothers, or Bat instead of Doc and the Earp brothers, because Wyatt and Bat also considered themselves best friends. But Wyatt, when tensions were getting higher in the spring of 1881, and Wyatt was actually trying to run the gambling casino part of a hotel in Tombstone, and he feared that there was going to be some violence, and he needed somebody else that he can count on. And he immediately thought of Bat, because they had always had each other back in Dodge City. So he put an SOS out, which Bat immediately responded to and came to Tombstone, and with his gun, his white-plated, white-handled guns, and went to work with Wyatt at the casino. And they had each other's back like they did in Dodge City. But while Bat was in Tombstone, he gets a telegram saying that his younger brother, Ed, Bill, I think it is, some assassins are out to get his brother, who's now the marshal of Dodge City. And Bat needs to come quick to save his brother's life. And Wyatt's the very first one to tell Bat, listen, your brother, I know from myself, brothers come first. You go to Dodge City, take care of business. And then Bat races away from Tombstone to Dodge City, where indeed he arrives in time for a big gunfight that he and his brother survive. But that's like a story that always gets left on the cutting room floor, so to speak, that Bat Masterson was with Wyatt Earp in Tombstone.
Somebody else writes, I read somewhere that John Wayne met Wyatt Earp when Wayne was a boy. Do you have any idea if that is true?
I think if I remember correctly, there's a story to that effect in the John Wayne biography that came out, published by Simon & Schuster 2 or 3 years ago, which is a wonderful biography. So I would recommend it. And I think to give some context to that story is that in the 1920s, Wyatt Earp and his fourth wife, Josephine, who had been together by that point for about 40 years, over 40 years, they lived in Los Angeles. And Wyatt was in his 70s then. And he would be hired to be a consultant on silent Westerns. Tom Mix was a big fan of his, Hopalong Cassidy. And one of those young rising silent film directors was John Ford. And John Ford would, make Wyatt Earp made some extra money by consulting with John Ford. And Ford was, Ford and Raoul Walsh was another director who made use of John Wayne as an extra, as a prop man, as a bit actor. John Wayne had been a student at University of Southern California and was basically trying to get his way into the movies. So if I remember the biography correctly, there probably was, I'm not sure if the biographer is certain about it, or conjecturing that it was likely that during one of the times when Wyatt Earp was on the set as a consultant to one of the pictures of silent Westerns being made, John Wayne would have been introduced to him. So it might be surprising if he wasn't, because Wayne, especially when he was a very young man, made a zillion pictures. Even if he just had one line, even if he was just an extra in a crowd scene, he would take any role that was offered to him. And so it would be quite likely that he met John Wayne on one of the sets.
All right. Somebody else asks, do you have an opinion on Costner's Earp versus Russell's Tombstone as far as historical accuracy?
I think I found Tombstone a little more accurate. Kevin Costner, I thought, was a very good Wyatt Earp. In fact, I think that he probably resembles the real Wyatt Earp in his 30s more than other actors who portrayed Wyatt Earp, but Kurt Russell comes close. I think they both take some liberties. Tombstone, for example, has a scene towards the end of the picture where Doc Holliday gets into a gunfight with Johnny Ringo. I don't want to give too much away, but that actually never happened. So that takes liberties too. I think that I like, to me, my personal favorite is Tombstone. I think Wyatt Earp's a good picture. I think Lawrence Kasdan wrote a very good screenplay. And I like Dennis Quaid also as his portrayal of Doc Holliday in there. But I think the casting is so good in Tombstone. In addition to Kurt Russell, I think Sam Elliott. I think of Virgil Earp and I think of Sam Elliott. I thought he was tremendous. Obviously, Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday. Bill Pullman, the young Bill Pullman, as Morgan Earp. Dana Delaney as Josephine Marcus. Those who are playing Curly Bill Brosi as Johnny Ringo. There's a really good ensemble cast that I think I just happen to enjoy watching that picture a little bit more than Wyatt Earp. But if anybody else is going to lean more towards the Kevin Costner version, that's fine. I think you get it. You get most of the story in that one also.
Somebody else asks, as a researcher, how do you find those little details, like how many shots were fired and how long the gunfight lasted?
Well, one of the fortunate things about researching the Tombstone story is that you had at the time two newspapers, the Tombstone Nugget and the Tombstone Epitaph. So you can go back. I'm not saying the archives are not complete, but you can go back to the archives and see the reporting being done. And again, I'm not saying that the reporters were eventual Pulitzer Prize winners, but there were stories and articles appearing in the newspaper the same week that events were happening. So you can go back to what are called contemporaneous sources. Also, the two people I mentioned before, Clara Browne, you go back to her pieces that were published. Her eyewitness accounts, George Parsons with his journals, and there are others too. So it's not a very exciting, certainly not a sexy occupation to research. You spend a lot of your time either physically in libraries, which I enjoy doing, and I'm so lucky. I mean, I almost forgot I was talking to a library audience. So I was going to say this anyway. So lucky that I've met so many terrific librarians over the years, reference librarians, other librarians. You know, that makes the job, I think, more interesting for them. In some cases, thrilling that somebody comes in and says, here's what I'm working on. I'm hoping to find this. Can you help me? You know, I think somebody like me, can you help me? I'm not afraid to ask that question. I need help. And they will help you find information. But the rest of it is my job. Go through that information, go through it carefully, take good notes, organize things, so that when the time comes for the actual writing, you're not floundering, or as little as possible. You've got as much information as you could possibly ferret out and organize. And then you'll find that maybe you did come across some things nobody else did. Or maybe you're going to put them in a sequence which not only makes sense, but is part of a more interesting narrative maybe than somebody else did. So I think that answers the question.
Yes, sir. Somebody else asks, and so there's two kind of related questions here, or I'm going to relate them, whether they are or not. The first one is Dodge City or Tombstone, which was the wilder Wild West town? And then another person asks, which book was your favorite to write?
Dodge City was definitely the wildest town. I mean, in the subtitle of that book, I used the phrase that was common at the time. It was referred to as the wickedest town of the American West. It was still earlier than Tombstone as far as the American frontier and attempts to civilize the frontier towns, to have a law and order system, to have a court system. So it was more taken for granted in Dodge City that people could get away with things. It was also a major hub for the cattle drives coming up from Texas to Dodge City where the railroad was. And so you had, at any given time, perhaps dozens, if not hundreds of cowboys with money in their pockets, plenty of bullets in their guns. They wanted to drink, they wanted women, they wanted to party. And so the challenge was, I think, much greater for Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson and their allies, Charlie Bassett and others, in Dodge City in the 1875 to 79 period, then Tombstone. Tombstone very quickly was trying to make, and somewhat successfully, that transition to a more sophisticated 20th century city. Nobody was more shocked than the Tombstone residents when there was a gunfight like that. Tombstone probably would have become a sort of San Francisco of the Southwest, except only a few years after the silver mines were discovered, the mines flooded and basically could not be mined anymore. As far as my favorite book, I think I probably shouldn't do this. It's like if I want to say which one is my favorite, is my daughter my favorite or my son my favorite? That can only get you into trouble. But I think with Dodge City, I'm not going to say what's my favorite book, but maybe the question was favorite book to write. I would say Dodge City, and the reason is it was all undiscovered country to me. I had not done a book about the American West in the 1870s and 1880s before. I had done a co-written book called The Heart of Everything That Is, which takes place in the plains in the 1850s and 60s for the most part. But to deal with iconic Western characters in their prime on the edge of the American frontier in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, that was all new to me. So there was like an extra excitement to doing that book and discovering new aspects to stories that I thought I knew, and discovered that I, like many people, I only knew the surface.
All right, we got two more questions here, unless another one comes in that just blows me away. We'll start here. It's amazing the few degrees of separation that exist between some of these almost mythical figures of the Wild West. Is that just a perception, or are all of these figures really intertwined the way they seem to be?
Well, that's a great observation or question that I find myself amazed at too. In all three of the books in the Frontier Lawmen trilogy, you have some of these significant characters intersecting with each other on a fairly regular basis. In Wild Bill, for example, he confronts not once but twice Frank and Jesse James. He confronts Wild Buffalo Bill because one of his closest friends, and they have all kinds of adventures together, which are detailed in the book. We have again a number of lawmen and outlaws that Wild Bill confronts. Custer, he scouts for the 7th Cavalry, whose leader is George Washington Custer. Libby Custer, George's wife, falls madly in love with Wild Bill. And then in Dodge City becomes like this epicenter for people passing through, either to stay or to pass through on their way to other parts of the West. And Belle Starr as an important scene in the book Dodge City. And Bat Masterson becomes friends with Frank and Jesse James, especially Frank James. They remain friends for the rest of Frank's life. And then in Tombstone, again, you have more of these characters intersecting with each other. When you think how vast the American West is geographically, you think, how would they possibly, with the transportation systems being a lot more primitive, than what we have today. But I think that's what made the stories so much fun to do, is that, oh, look who pops up here in this particular month in 1880. It's a lot of fun to make this discovery and then tell those stories.
All right, we will finish up then with this question. Who fired first? I think in most of the arguments I have in my world, the answer to that question is Han Solo, but I think she might be looking for something more specific to the book.
Yeah, and that's people with different agendas since the gunfight at the OK Corral have accused either the McLaurys and Clantons of firing first or the Earps of firing first. They've said that the Earps wanted this confrontation and wanted to kill McLaurys and the Clantons, or that the Clantons and the McLaurys wanted to kill the Earps. It is true that on that day, in October 1881, Ike Clanton basically had a bottle in one hand and a gun in the other, and he was roaming around Tombstone, shouting to anybody who would listen to him that he was there to kill the Earps. And eventually his brother came into town and the McLaurys came into town and they joined together. So I think at the very least, the behavior of Ike Clanton makes it more likely that once the Earps were physically in front of them, they saw it themselves either, here's our chance to kill them, or we've got to fire first in self-defense before the Earps fire at us. What seems to be the case is that it was a series of miscalculations or errors. Virgil Earp was trying to talk the McLaurys and Clantons to give up their guns and just get on their horse and leave town. Nobody has to get hurt. And they weren't doing that, and there was a standoff. Now, maybe given another minute or two, they might have said, okay, we don't want to get hurt. Here's our guns. We'll come back and get them tomorrow. We're out of here. But it seems that it's considered a possibility that Doc Holliday, sensing that there might be gunshots very, very soon, pulled back the hammers of the shotgun. And that clicking sound, the Clantons and the McLaurys responded to that because they thought they were about to get shot. There's also been a version in which Morgan also fires first. Like, let's get this over with. He was kind of a hothead. Let's get this over with. To me, I don't think we'll ever know the answer exactly. But I sort of favor the possibility that it was a mistake that gunfight began. It didn't have to, but I think the sound of Doc Holliday pulling the hammers back was set off, because even when the guns started firing, Virgil's raising his hands and saying, I didn't want this. I didn't want this. He's pleading for the gunfire to stop. But the stallion was out of the barn, 30 shots in 30 seconds.
Thank you, Tom. This was great.
Well, because you can see I'm fading to black here.
We appreciate you joining us. Hopefully next time we'll be back in the library, but thanks for doing this. That was great.
I would love to. Thanks very much. And thanks everybody for listening.
If you're interested in the book, please do give Rainy Day a call or visit them at rainydaybooks.com. Stop by the store in Fairway. The book is fantastic. Give it a look. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.